Well, welcome everyone. I'm really excited to introduce and moderate this webinar. My name is Adam Lichtenheld. I'm the Executive Director of the Immigration Policy Lab at Stanford University. And we're going in this webinar to describe the IPL Integration Index, which is a survey tool that we developed to measure the integration of refugees and other immigrants around the world. And we're going to walk through how you, whether you're joining this webinar as a researcher, as a policymaker, as a practitioner, as an advocate, how you can adopt this tool to understand integration in the context in which you work. Next slide, please. So this is an outline for what we're going to do today. Our panelists have about a 30 to 45-minute presentation, and then we're going to have about 45 minutes of Q&A. This is being recorded, and it will be available on our website, so don't feel like you need to furiously write everything down, as you'll be able to come back and refer to what we discussed today. And we're currently updating our website to include a repository of different versions and translations of the integration index that should be available hopefully in the next couple of weeks. A little bit of kind of housekeeping or some logistical matters. We welcome those of you who are with us today in the Zoom to use the raised hand feature and unmute yourself to ask your questions, which we'll do at the end of the webinar. But you may also submit questions at any point via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer them at the end. Next slide. So I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists. In addition to myself, our speakers include David Laitin, who's a professor of political science at Stanford University and a faculty co-director of the Immigration Policy Lab here. Niklas Harder, who is the department co-head at the German Center for Integration and Migration Research, or DeZIM, in Berlin, Germany. And Maureen Casales, who we're currently working to get to join the webinar, who is a project director for the Immigration Policy Lab at our sister branch at ETH Zurich in Switzerland. So those are the individuals who will be talking to us about the tool and who played really instrumental roles in both developing the tool and in applying it in different contexts, since we'll be able to speak based on their experience. Now, before I turn it over to David and we really get into the details of the tool, I did want to just briefly introduce the Immigration Policy Lab and who we are, if you don't mind going to the next slide. So we are a team of social scientists, data scientists, and practitioners at Stanford University and ETH Zurich in Switzerland, which, as I mentioned on the last slide, we have individuals from both branches represented on this panel. And what we try to do is drive policy innovation and help policymakers and practitioners make more informed decisions regarding migration, governance, and policymaking. And we do this by partnering with those working on the front lines of immigration policy, again, like many of you who joined this call are, to actually generate rigorous evidence about what works and what doesn't in the immigration policy space, and to help design new solutions, from measurement and data collection tools to new programmatic approaches. So this webinar focuses on one of those tools, and in order to introduce it, I'll pass it over to David Laitin.
It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to speak for only a few minutes, giving some broad background about the index. The nitty-gritty will take most of the time, so just be patient. You will get to the important application issues shortly. As Adam mentioned, the IPL-12 is a survey-based tool that measures the degree to which immigrants have acquired the knowledge and capacity to build a successful, fulfilling life in the host society, not the degree to which they have shed their cultural heritage. That is, you can be well integrated and still have borscht for dinner or tacos for lunch. This is not assimilation. It's the ability to perform well to your capacity to build successful, fulfilling life in the host society. Why was it created? Prior to our IPL Integration Index, There was no common measure of immigrant integration that would allow a comparison of integration levels of different migrant populations across countries and over time. What was interesting to us when we created our lab 6 or 7 years ago is how could we possibly discuss whether there's integration success if we didn't have a measure to actually define it, and for which we would be able to say integration is more successful in place X or place Y or time T1 or time T2. In the indices that we found, about 200 of them we looked at to develop our own, frequently only immigrant employment status or language proficiency were used to measure integration. This not only fails to represent the complex and multifaceted concept of immigrant integration, it also makes it hard to compare and accumulate knowledge from different studies across time and space. So what is the objective? The goal of the index was to create a simple, pragmatic, and adaptable survey measure. Let me say again, simple, pragmatic, and adaptable. That is to say, one that could be attached to almost any survey research that any of you can do, just adding moments to the survey to link it to survey research, to link it to integration indices elsewhere performed. It's a simple, pragmatic, and adaptable survey measure that could produce comparable data across most important dimensions of integration. Our hope is that such data will create an empirical foundation for evidence-based policies to foster migrant integration. Now for the nitty-gritty, I pass the microphone to Niklas Harder, who's going to get to the actual application.
All right. Thank you, David, and hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. Let me briefly go over some criteria for a useful measure that we outlined when we started our work. So the first is, of course, construct validity. That means that we are basically measuring what we want to measure. The next one is a bit more tricky. It's a clear directionality. This means that on every question that we ask, we want to say, okay, the more someone goes into this direction in responding to this question, the better for integration, all things being equal. So that means, for example, I think income is a good example. All other things being equal, having a higher income is usually better for integration than not having a higher income. Of course, we can talk about that you don't need to earn in the top 10 percentile of the population, all of that to be fully integrated, but we don't need a reference point to say, okay, if you need to hit that point to be integrated, and you can, and I don't know, there can be too much or too little integration. This was, I think it's quite clear in theory, but it was tricky to figure out with the question. As David said, we did not want to measure assimilation. That means we did not presume that you need to shed your old cultural repertoire in order to integrate. And the question needed to be questions that we could ask many different groups across societies over time and also in societies. So for example, we started with a lot of questions on how, for example, regarding your workplace. If you have lunch with your colleagues, of course, we cannot ask this to anyone who is unemployed. So all these questions we had to cancel. Same is true for what language does your child speak at school or something like that. This question will only work if someone has a child. So we had to drop all these questions. Then the question need to be administered through different modes, be it phone, online, WhatsApp, or in person. This limited our use of pictures, for example, or very interactive questions. And of course, we wanted to recognize the multidimensionality of the concept, and this is something that I will come to in a bit. Next slide, please. Based on these ideas, we started with an expert workshop and reviewed more than 50 surveys on integration. After that, we had 200 and a few more questions with the potential to differentiate between high and low integration. We then structured them because we wanted to include questions from different fields of research, so that many researchers could find something familiar and maybe a bit more useful to them than all the other questions. That means we looked towards economics for economic integration, towards psychology when looking at psychological integration, towards sociology regarding social integration, and so forth. And then we basically needed to narrow down the question we had. For this, we did in different iteration 8 surveys, where each round we asked these questions and then looked at the results, and basically after each round dropped questions that didn't work. And after 8 rounds of this, we finally came to a set of 12 and 24 questions that we thought did a good job. And then we went into the field again, and we wanted to validate these questions. And we did 4 more surveys to validate the questions we had. And then we were actually successful with the validation. I will show you the questions and our approach to validation now. Next slide, please. We came up with 2 survey measures. One we called the IPL-12 because it's made out of 12 questions, 2 questions per or 2 questions over 6 dimensions, and the IPL-24, which is basically the IPL-12 plus another 2 questions per dimension. The dimensions we are looking at are the psychological dimension, economic dimension, political dimension, social dimension, linguistic dimension, and navigational dimension. I think most of them are pretty easy to understand. Navigational integration sometimes raises questions. What we mean with that is basically everyday knowledge you need to have in order to organize your life in a new country. And you can see that in the question. So our questions for the IPL-12 is we ask them if they know how and where to find help from a doctor, and how and where to look for jobs. And for the IPL-24, we ask them whether they would know how to get help with legal problems in this country. And then we also have a little quiz where we ask some simple question on the life in the new country. This is something like, how would you write an address on a letter? Or where would you go with severe back pain? Something like that. For the other dimensions, I will go over the questions of the IPL-12 briefly, because I think these are the most relevant. For psychological integration, we ask about their connection to the host country, and we ask them if they feel like an outsider. In economic integration, we ask for income and employment status. This is very straightforward and actually already included in most surveys, which is, I think, great because it limits survey time. For political integration, we ask them to assess their subjective knowledge about the political system and politics in their host country. And we ask them how frequently they discuss major political issues with acquaintances. For social integration, we ask how often the respondents have dinner with locals, and we ask them about the frequency of social contacts with locals. For linguistic integration, we ask for them to assess their reading level and their speaking level in the local language. And then for navigational integration, as I just said, we ask them whether they know how and where to see a doctor and how and where to look for jobs. So with these questions, we now wanted to know if they work, and we did 2 main analyses. The first is we ran 4 surveys where we had a strong idea how the average of each survey should rank in terms of integration. So we ran a survey on high-income white immigrants in the United States. This is sample A here. High income is maybe quite clear. Why did we choose white immigrants? Well, we thought that they should have the least issues with discrimination and racial bias against them, which could hamper integration. So we would assume that we would expect them to score quite highly in integration. And you can see here the 4 samples. The sample I just talked about is the one on the left in green, sample A. And our index is basically rescaled to range from 0 to 1, and they score quite high on average. The second sample, sample B here, was a stratified online sample of all kinds of immigrant in Germany. So here we would assume something below sample A, but also somewhere we wanted to have an average somewhere above 0.5, because these are immigrants that have been in the country for a while and that should do quite well, and we see that here as well. Sample C, on the other hand, we expected to score a little lower because these were low-income immigrants who qualified for naturalization in New York. So this means these were immigrants who've been in the country for a bit, but had economic issues or were just low income. So we would assume, okay, that we know that they won't score high on this dimension, but they should score high on others. So they should rank a little lower than the others, but still maybe above 0.5 because they're not really new to the country. And we see something like that here. And the third sample were very recent immigrants that we surveyed in San Jose while they took part in English as a second language classes. So we knew they were new to the country and they were still studying English. And there we wanted to see average that was definitely below 0.5. And this is what we got. And we were quite happy with that. And you can see here the values for the IPL-12 and the IPL-24, and it's very similar. Then we wanted to learn about what does this index actually correlate with, and we ran a few analyses and we came to these results. Next slide, please. So what you see here are correlation between our index and different other variables, and basically if the point is on the 0 line, then there's no correlation. And we see that there is no or little correlation with age and gender, which is great because age and gender by themselves should not affect integration. We see a slightly positive correlation with education, which might make sense because it might be easier to like work your way through into a new society and system if you're a bit more educated. We see a slightly positive correlation for immigrants that have a shared language with the host country. And then we see larger correlations with residency and legal status as a permanent resident or with naturalized immigrants. And this is something we want to see because we expect that people who have these more solid legal statuses, have been in the country in a while, are usually employed, have some income and so forth. So we want to see that. So given these results, we are now quite confident that we are measuring what we actually want to measure. Let me briefly talk about what the difference is between the IPL-12 and the IPL-24. Next slide, please. In general, both indexes produce a single measure of integration that ranges from 0, least integrated, to 1, very integrated. And the IPL-12 is a subset of the IPL-24. This means, and you can see this on the right, the scores are highly correlated. This also means using just the IPL-12 will give you very similar results to using the more extensive IPL-24. That being said, using the IPL-24 also takes 3 times as long to administer on average as compared to the IPL-12, which takes about 2 minutes to administer. So given that it costs a lot more time, but the results are similar, we say that usually for most cases, it's sufficient to use the IPL-12. However, if a certain dimension is of special interest to you and you really want to dive deeper into that dimension, we recommend using the additional questions from the IPL-24. because they are pre-tested and they are in themselves also informative, and they will help you understand this dimension of integration better. If you are interested to go deeper into several dimensions of integration, then use the full IPL-24. It is still a great tool. It's a bit more, it's more intense than the IPL-12, but it's still great. Next slide, please. I will now talk about adapting and translating the index to different contexts, because we developed this index with, I would say, the typical Western host countries in mind. So when we developed the index, we thought mostly about, can this be applied in the United States? Could this be applied in UK, France, Germany, Sweden, and so forth? This is definitely, I think this thinking was influenced by the world events that took place when we developed the index. We developed that index in, I think we started in 2016. So we just saw a lot of migration towards Europe. So these were the countries we had in mind. But of course, there is migration and integration going on in many other countries in the world, and sometimes not everything works there. So far we know of researchers who have used this in Greece or France or the United States, as we envisioned it to be used, but also in Brazil, the Dominican Republic, Peru, Lebanon, Japan, and so forth. And some of them had to adapt the index a bit to work there. And I want to talk about how to do that. Let me first start with how to translate the tool, though. Next slide, please. So in general, we think that it is important to offer the questionnaire in the native language of the respondents. Not all will want to take the questionnaire in their native language. We made the experience that some immigrants are very eager to take the questions in the language of their host country. But I think everyone should offer the questionnaire in the native language of the respondents, and the level of that language should be easy to understand. So this shouldn't, it's quite important if you work with translators to say them. So this isn't literature. You shouldn't write beautiful language. You should write easy to understand language, which sometimes, if translators aren't used to translating surveys, is important to say. Of course, for some questions, you need to adapt the context. So for example, we feel, do you feel isolated in the United States? And if you use that in Greece, of course, you want to change United States to Greece. And also we ask, how often do you share dinner with Americans? So this needs to be changed as well. So, so you need to change the language and the context. And let me follow up here, because there was some, I mean, we didn't know what to use what term to use when we wanted to refer to the local population. We, in the end, prioritized simplicity and used the very general but easy to understand term Americans to refer to the rooted population. Instead of a more specific terms that would be something like American citizens by birth who lived in the country since birth, or something like that. So because this gets, the more you think about it, the more specific it gets. And also many people won't know all this specificity, all this about people they meet in their everyday life. So it makes the questions really hard to answer. And we did some tests in what people understand when we say Americans, American citizens, and so forth. And the difference wasn't that big. So we said, okay, let's keep it simple and use these very general terms. And we had a good experience with that so far. And another thing is that we were asked a couple of times that there are, of course, countries that have 2 or more official languages. And which language to use in that case, like for translating, but also for asking about linguistic integration. And we said, like, keep it in the language that immigrants will need in their everyday life. So what is the language they use to interact with other people around them, but also with authorities and so forth. This already goes towards how to adapt. Oh no, I'm sorry, I missed something. So we already have some translations ready to use, and we recently restructured the website we have. And here we now have a great downloads menus. Thank you for everyone who worked on this, where you can see we have this little table, and you can see here translation. So this is the questionnaire made to be used in Switzerland in the language Italian, Portuguese, and Spanish. The version here is short. This means IPL-12. We have this, and we have this as a Word file to be downloaded. And then you can basically go and see, okay, which country do I want to use this in? Which language in this country can I use? And then you can download it. We don't have all possible interactions between country to be used and a language to be used available, but we already have a pretty good collection of translations here, and you can go through the table and see if you find anything that works for the context you want to use this in. Next slide, please. We also have some guidelines on how to adapt the index, and I will go over the most important points now. Next slide, please. So I will go through this by the dimensions of integration, and maybe the most complicated dimension to adapt is the economic dimension, because here we ask for income, and you can talk about income in very different terms. So you can ask for net or gross income, you can ask for your monthly income, you can ask for your yearly income. And we didn't want to limit researchers to one of these combinations, because the way people talk about the income in different countries varies a lot. So in some countries, you always talk about your income pre-tax, and other countries always after tax, and so forth. So before you adapt the income question in your survey, please be sure that you know how people in the country and context you survey usually talk about their income, and then use that income. Also, this is the second criteria, there should be some sort of national representative statistic of the median value of that respective income type. Because on the back end, we then basically rephrase the answers in terms of the median income. So we want to know, do people earn at least a third of the median income? Do they earn at least 2/3 of the median income? Do they earn more than the median income? And for that, we need some median value. So if you use this in a new country, please check, I don't know, data from the National Bureau of Statistics, from the census, the central banks, or other academic articles to get up-to-date statistic of the median income value of that country. And then we asked for the household income, and we were looking for a very broad definition of a household, and we said, with a household, we mean everyone with whom you share an apartment or house and with whom you're also related by birth, marriage, partnership, or adoption. We are aware that this definition might not work in every context. So if you adapt the index to a new context, please revisit this definition and see if it makes sense. Maybe talk to some people on the ground what they understand under this definition, and if need be, then slightly change that, please. Next slide, please. You should also check our question on the employment status. We list a pretty extensive list of different employment statuses, but there might be contexts where some of these statuses are just not plausible, or where there are other plausible but not listed alternative employment situations. If you add new employment situation and you wonder which score to assign them when you code the answers, here is how we scored the answer. We basically scored every answer to the employment question either with 1, 3, or 5. And a score of 1 is assigned if a respondent is unemployed and has no other daily activity that keeps them from working. I think this is what we would define as like the typical unemployment situation. A score of 3 is assigned if a respondent is in unpaid work in school or is unemployed due to sickness, disability, or old age, or because they care for family, for example. So here we think of people who have something to do day to day, who might even meet people while doing this, but who do not really earn an income while doing that. And a score of 5, which is the maximum score that we assign, is assigned if a respondent is employed, earns an income, or earns an income in a different way. For example, military service would be one of these situations. So, and I think with these guidelines, you can add new types or new employment situations and score them correctly. Next slide, please. So we got a lot of questions about how to adapt the political dimension, because in some countries, question like how well do you know politics in this country and how often do you discuss politics can be very sensitive. And we would say if this question is deemed so sensitive that answering this question will put respondents in danger, or make respondents mistrust you as a researcher, and if they will feel suspicious about your survey, if you ask them how often they discuss politics, then it's better to leave out these questions on political integration. We checked, and leaving out one dimension from the 6 does not, in most cases, change the overall score dramatically. So it is usually acceptable, if you have good reasons, to exclude one dimension. Things do not correlate anymore if you leave out more than one, but leaving out one is still possible. So if you think that asking these questions does more harm than good in the overall survey setting, then please feel free to exclude them. Navigational dimension, yeah. Here also, please check the local context. I think if you just use the IPL-12, you don't need to adapt it, these questions necessarily, because here we ask about how to get medical help and how to find a job. And I think these are important things to know in nearly all contexts where the survey is used. But if you use the questions from the IPL-24, please check if our quiz questions on things you should know in day-to-day life make sense, and also please review the answers to make sure that the correct answer is actually listed. We also had researchers design new questions because the questions we provided did not make sense to them. And you can find out more about why they did that and how they did that if you look onto our website, where we describe in greater detail how the survey was adapted to be used in Brazil, Peru, and the Dominican Republic. What is important is if you design new question, please have the difficulty level in mind. So this, basically the difficulty level should be, let's call it medium. Not everybody should get it right, but also it shouldn't be a question that is super hard to answer. So it should be something that someone who engaged into their respective activity a couple of times should be able to answer correctly, but someone who's never exposed to it should have trouble answering that. It's not easy. We actually have 4 quiz questions in our instrument, and I think we started with 12 or so, and we really had to cut a lot of them. All right. The final question we often get is about adding or removing questions. So we designed this index to make research on integration comparable between different research projects. And that for this index to be comparable and informative to other researchers, we need to use the same questions in every research project. So looking at it from this angle means please do not drop questions unless you really think that you put your respondents at risk or the respondents' trust into your survey. There were situations where other researchers came to us and said, well, we don't expect a lot of variation in the answers to these questions. For example, sharing dinner with other people is very common in Brazil. Everybody will say that they do this at least once a week. So this is not very informative to us. When we said, well, but that means they still have dinner at least once a week with the local population, which is great and probably much better than much more frequent than immigrants in the United States or Germany or Sweden share dinner with locals. So this is informative in the general scheme of things. Please keep it if you want to use this index to compare it to research from other countries. So to summarize this, please be very cautious when dropping questions. You do not need to be so cautious when you want to add questions, because I mean, we do not claim that we capture all possible aspects of immigrant integration. And if there are certain aspects of it that are really of great interest to you, please add them to your survey. Do not add them when calculating the index score. And we always advise to use pre-tested questions. There are several databases out there that are linked here where you can find pre-tested questions that worked well in other surveys. Please review them and see if you find a question that works given your interest and your context. And with that, I want to hand over to Marine, who will talk about how they applied this index in a research project in Greece.
Great, thanks, Niklas, and hi, everyone. Great to be here today. So as Niklas said, I will basically present two use cases where we applied the IPL Integration Index, first in Greece, and then in the Latin America and Caribbean context. So in this project in Greece, essentially what we did is that we partnered with UNHCR, Mobile Info Team, and the International Rescue Committee, IRC, with two main goals in mind. First, we wanted to explore the integration challenges of refugees and asylum seekers in Greece, or obstacles and opportunities. And second, we wanted to evaluate the effect of providing information to people on the move. So as many of you know, like in a displacement context, a lot of NGOs set out to provide information to refugees and asylum seekers so they can find their way around the country. And so in this specific project, we essentially look at the effect of providing information to these people. And also, and I will show this in a second, like we compare two different types of information provision. And so how did we do this? We essentially ran a survey with more than 3,750 displaced persons in Greece. And in the survey, we included the IPL Integration Index. And as Niklas said, we essentially adapted it to the Greek context and also to the population that we surveyed in Greece, which were essentially, mainly people from Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, and DRC. Next slide, please. So what did we find in doing this exercise? So on the first goal, on the integration challenges, we found that the two dimensions where people scored the highest in the IPL Integration Index were the psychological and economic dimensions, although 2/3 were unemployed, and with actually a pronounced gender disparity that the index allowed us to look at, where it was about, I think, 84% of the women were not working versus a bit over 50% of the men who were not working. And another interesting finding is that we found that about half of the sample stated that it would actually like to stay in Greece. And then for the second goal, if you can just click again. Yeah, thanks a lot. For the information provision, so as I said, we first wanted to look at the effect of providing any kind of information in general to displaced people, but then we also wanted to compare two types of information provision. So on the one hand, what we call generic information, which is essentially like going on a website, browsing and looking for information by yourself, versus what we call personalized information, which in this case was a WhatsApp hotline run by caseworkers in Greece. And what we found is that there was indeed a higher take-up for generic information, so the website, but even though there was like a lower take-up for the personalized information, it actually had a higher effect on two outcomes, which were knowledge of exploitation and coping with violence. And we actually could not find any effect of this information provision on integration. Next slide, please. We also ran a project in the Latin America and the Caribbean context, and I know that some of our colleagues from IOM are in the room today, so I want to thank them again for the great partnership and the project we run together. So basically, we partnered with IOM to adapt the Integration Index to 3 countries, Brazil, Dominican Republic, and Peru. Again, with 2 main goals in mind. We wanted to first look at, in a way, like a descriptive analysis of the integration of Venezuelans and Haitians in Brazil and the Dominican Republic. And second, we wanted to look at the effect of a cash-based intervention that IOM was running in Peru to support vulnerable Venezuelans. And so how did we do this? We ran a survey with around 4,800 beneficiaries of IOM programs. And again, in the survey, we included the IPL Integration Index adapted to each of these countries and in the respective languages. Next slide, please. And for the second goal, so this evaluation of the cash transfer, basically what we found is that in Peru, a one-time cash transfer of 760 soles, which is about 200 USD or 74% of the monthly minimum salary, increased integration. And this was mostly driven by the social, economic, and navigational dimensions. And we also saw that this one-time cash transfer fostered intentions to immigrate away from Peru. So this is really just a snapshot of 2 use cases, and I'm happy to answer any further questions in the Q&A and give more details. And I turn now to David for the conclusion.
So let me say a few general points in conclusion before we take up your questions for discussion. First, that the IPL Integration Index offers a versatile survey tool for measuring integration. And if I may jump ahead for a moment on Professor Claire Adida's question, partially addressed by Marina, yes, we applied this for both immigrants and refugees. And its versatility is such that we would be able to ask, in general, is the pattern of integration of the 6 dimensions different for immigrants from refugees? And why is this so? Requiring different kinds of ameliorative policies. This is only possible with surveys that could be applied to both populations, its versatility. It has to have construct validity. And I think we showed in one of our slides that the integration scores were on average higher for groups that had been in the country for longer and for groups that had closer languages than the host country, which showed that it was actually measuring what we thought it was measuring, a key to construct validity. Third, we showed the importance of the multidimensionality of integration, that it's not just economic success, it's not just social success of meeting people who are locals, but it has a wider set of criteria for successful lives in the host country. It has to be available in several languages, and we at the IPL in Stanford and in Zurich are working on translations for a number of languages for easy application, but we expect the research community to continue in the translation because we believe that it's important to offer the home language of the surveyed individual if she or he wants it. It should be applied in a variety of countries and contexts, and we'll discuss that when we answer the question about what questions we had to drop because they couldn't be applied in a particular set of countries or contexts. Niklas described in some important detail the minor adaptations needed to tailor to different contexts, but insisted that questions not be dropped because they didn't perfectly fit for a particular country or would get widespread answers of yes, because that would make it comparability across cases more difficult to demonstrate. We discussed the linguistic integration questions. Linguistic integration is the only case where it's an overlap with assimilation because language has both a cultural and a cultural as well as a chance for successful lives in the host country as a necessary condition. We've discussed political integration questions and how they can be sensitive and how this might be dealt with. And for the research community, Niklas and others, but Niklas in the lead, has shown in our website how to compute the scores for easy comparison across cases. So these are the basic points we hope we have underlined in this webinar. And I think we can now be open to questions, and Adam will host the Q&A.
Well, thank you so much, David and Niklas and Maureen, for offering your insights and giving more background about the index, about how to adapt it, about use cases. And I think what's really important to emphasize here is that this is one measure of integration. It's not the only one, or we're not trying to say it's even necessarily the best one, but we wanted to offer kind of a practical measure and tool. And I think, as you can see from both Niklas's comments and some of the examples that Maureen gave, we are constantly learning and trying to kind of update and inform and improve the index as we deploy it more in more contexts with more populations, or we have others who do it and are able to inform us. So if you do use it, please let us know, and we would love your feedback. And I think some of the different questions that are coming through on the Q&A kind of reflect, both the interests and some of the feedback that you're all able to provide. So I'm going to get us started, and please, as I said at the beginning, if you have questions, feel free to drop them into the Q&A section of the webinar, or we'll also open it up and let people, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question in real time, you can do that. But I'm going to get us started with a question that was asked actually as part of the registration process. And it is a question that we get a fair amount. So I think it's important to, maybe I'll have Niklas, you start reflecting on this, is, to what extent does the instrument, or were there considerations in constructing the instrument, integrating migrants' own conceptualization of their integration, what they perceive to be successful integration? Niklas, do you want to offer some initial thoughts on that?
About the self-perception of integration?
Yes, please.
Yes. So I think there's an empirical and a theoretical answer to that. I think I'll start empirically and then explain it with a theory. We had the question, how integrated do you feel on a scale from, I think, 1 to 10? We had this question in many of our first surveys. And looking at the responses, we saw that the answers didn't correlate with anything else. So first, for example, we always checked if the answer to a question we used correlated with residency, like the length of residency in a country, because we think if we know anything about integration, it usually increases over time. So there should be at least a minimal correlation here. And it just wasn't good, this correlation. And so for empirical reasons, it was tough to make the case to include this question, because it really messed with how our index worked. And On the other hand, theoretically, we realized that it also makes sense that it doesn't correlate too well, because I think we start our paper with saying there are many ways to understand the term integration. And we define it for the purpose of our paper and for the purpose of our index in a certain way. We're looking at the means and the capabilities immigrants have to build a successful life in a host society. There are many different ways to define that. And actually, if I ask someone in a survey, how integrated do you feel? They are probably not applying my definition or our definition of integration, but some other definition, and that already messes with the response. And another reason is that we also basically say in our paper that there are at least 6 different dimensions of integration that do not necessarily need to correlate, right? Someone with a high income in a host country does not need to identify with that country. Actually, we saw this quite a bit, like in a small preliminary survey, we surveyed some international workers in around Stanford in the Silicon Valley, and they all had great income. But if we asked them how accepted they felt, if they want to stay in the United States and so forth, responses were very mixed. Keep in mind, this was just after Trump was elected for the first time. On the other hand, we did some preliminary surveys with, I think, people who just got a green card through the green card lottery and just came to New York. So they were super new in the country. Some of them didn't speak English, but their psychological integration and that identification with the United States was through the roof. And they had very low income. So these dimensions don't need to correlate. They add up onto each other. This is how we see it. But an individual respondent, I would say most individuals would weight certain dimensions higher than other. So for someone, maybe right now in their point of life, their economic integration is the most important thing. So when I ask you how integrated do you feel, they will just think about that. They might not think about their day-to-day knowledge. So they basically assign weights to these 6 dimensions, and we don't do that. We basically look at them equally weighted. So I think these are some good theoretical reasons why the answers to these questions did not align well in our index and for our purpose. This doesn't mean that it isn't interesting to study the self-perception of integration, but I think that this is another research project, and it just didn't work well with what we set out to do. Yeah, and I think I would be happy to see some more research on how our index aligns with these self-perception and in what circumstances it doesn't align.
Thanks for that, Niklas. And I think that gets into some of the questions on the chat that I want to get to, and is one example of a question that Maurice asked, which is asking to give some more examples of questions that were maybe tested or considered and then dropped during the different iterations that you described earlier in the process. I think it relates, though, to a couple of other questions that follow, one from Annie and I think more of a comment than a question from Dina. And I think the first is that you talked about how you looked at construct validity for the index as a whole, but to what extent did you look at construct validity within the different dimensions of integration, the 6 dimensions that you outlined? And I think one of the comments from Dina, and I'm kind of lumping these together because I think they relate to each other, which is the indicators of social integration, focusing on, sharing a meal and socializing with others. And, her kind of comment was it kind of implies or suggests that you need to be more extroverted, or maybe is biased towards people that are more extroverted, and, goes out with people a lot. As opposed to people who are more introverted, but still might feel socially integrated. So I don't know, Niklas, if you want to respond to any of those comments or questions, and I'd also invite Niklas after you, maybe David, if you have any other thoughts on this or examples that you want to reference, feel free to add as well.
Sure. So actually we spend a lot of time working on the individual subscales, and the way we thought about this is that the scores from the different dimensions don't need to be correlated. We just add them. However, usually when you design such a measure, for example, I mean, psychologists and sociologists do this all the time. They often say, for example, if a psychologist wants to measure emotional intelligence, they ask a bunch of questions on emotional intelligence, and they should all measure the same thing, right? They should all measure, every question should pertain to your own emotional intelligence. So in the end, the answers should be correlated. And this is how we also looked at the individual dimensions. We said, okay, social integration for us is like one thing, and the 2 questions or the 4 questions we asked should be correlated. So here we just basically, each additional question shouldn't like introduce a completely new aspect of social integration or economic integration, but should increase the precision of the measurement. And so we did all these tests that psychologists usually do when developing their scales on the individual subscales, but not on the overall scale, because there the logic is a bit different. And to add to that, there was a second constraint, that was that the questions should have some, well, they should be a bit convincing at face if you just read them. So actually, one example is economic integration. I think most of us in our team liked a question from the IPL-24 the best, where we asked people if they can meet an unexpected but necessary expense of a certain amount. So basically we say, okay, think about an unexpected but necessary expense, like I don't know, a medical bill that is absolutely necessary. Could you meet an expense of $600, $1,000, $6,000, $10,000? And then they can say yes, no, 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 and so forth. And we all like that, because this basically subsumes the money you can get, maybe you have saved, or your income, or that you can gather from friends and family. And this is really what economic stability is all about. But then we said, if we want to limit us to 2 questions, and we tell someone we measure economic integration, but we do not ask for income or employment, they will just laugh. So here we said, okay, and I mean, these questions also performed well, but we said, okay, if we want to convince someone that this is about economic integration, we need employment, we need income. And then this other question about these expenses, we can add for the IPL-24, although we liked it best. So these were these 2 criteria, right? So correlation in the dimensions, and some, plausibility at face value. And yeah, if looking at Dina's question about the social indicators, I think, yes, to a certain extent, let's put it that way. So the question is, if we assume that someone needs to be an extrovert to socialize and to be socially integrated, I think what we define as social integration are actual social interactions with the local population. So in that sense, an extrovert who socializes more will have it easier to score high here, definitely, because they socialize more, and this in itself is something that helps with integration. Then Dina says, but this doesn't need to correlate with how much at home or how belonging they feel. And we would say that this is a different dimension. So for us, this would be psychological integration. So the psychological integration is all about how much do you feel you belong to the place you are now. How at home do you feel here? And this can correlate with your social integration, but it doesn't have to. I think we are perfectly fine with someone who says, like, I really feel like I belong here, but I don't really talk to people that much. That's fine. then we would say your psychological integration is high, which is great. Your social integration is not that high, which might be better if it's higher, but okay, like you can score high on our index if you're good on all dimensions but one. I don't know if that makes sense, but David, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, thanks, Niklas. I think, David, you wanted to comment?
Yes, I thought Dina's question was really profound. Let me look at this extrovert-introvert issue on an individual level and then on a group level. On an individual level, we could say that on average, from 1 to 10, that they're introverts and extroverts, about the same measure in all groups. So on average, this should balance itself out with a high number of immigrants or refugees. There'll be the same number of introverts and extroverts in all groups, so it shouldn't matter on an individual level. But if it's a cultural thing, say a particular group is so inward looking that it puts pressure on its members to avoid contact with locals, this is something different. And here we would say that a young person brought up in this immigrant group would not have the fullest opportunities for success because it would be limited in her or his social interactions. So here would be a case of a group having low social integration, but maybe high on other dimensions. So as a group characteristic, it would reveal something important. As an individual characteristic, it should show no difference across groups.
Thanks, David and Niklas, for those responses.
And may I add to that? Just, I think there's one thing we should be maybe more clear about. We don't think that you need to score the perfect score of integration to be integrated. As I said, we rescale all answers from 0 to 1, and we don't presume that someone needs to score 1 to be like fully integrated. Actually, we phrased all questions in a way that you can also ask them to non-immigrants. So every question should also be answerable by someone who's not an immigrant. And we also did that actually and asked an online sample of the general American population to answer all our questions. And I think we had like an average of like 0.8 or so on the index. So fairly high. But definitely not every American was on 1 on our index. And so even for someone who's not an immigrant, there are definitely ways to, I don't know, have more friends, understand the political system better, earn a higher income, even feel more that they belong than others. So I think if you have an integration score above 0.75 or so, that is already something that looks very similar to what we would expect an average non-immigrant to have.
And then I think on the question of other questions or considered measures that were dropped, Maureen, you wanted to come in with some examples based on the applications that you were a part of?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, like Niklas mentioned it already in his slides. So it's very often the political dimension that I think comes up, especially in the context that we study. And so I can think of 2 examples. In Syria, for example, in Lebanon, sorry, we run a survey with Syrian refugees. And so in this case, we completely removed the entire political dimension because it was just deemed too sensitive when we did focus group discussion and pilot survey. And in the case of Peru, actually, we decided to only keep 2 questions and not use the full battery. And we removed the quiz and the political activity, for example. And so we kept the more like general questions on how often do you discuss political issues. And then another one that can happen that you might want to drop as well, but maybe Niklas, you want to add to that, is the linguistic dimension. So I think if you are very short on survey time and your population is already native in the language of the country they are hosted, then this might be a dimension you might want to this might be like a dimension you might want to drop. But again, as Niklas mentioned, I think you should be very careful in general to drop any questions.
Yes, I would argue to be very careful with the linguistic integration, because especially when it comes to things like reading comprehension, I think our question is if people can read a newspaper article and basically understand the basic point. I think we also surveyed Swiss people on that, and even among Swiss natives, we had a variation in that question. Not everybody said I can read a newspaper article and perfectly understand everything in that newspaper article. And so I think this matters for the index, but also matters very practically in how well can I understand legal regulations pertaining to my status as an immigrant and so forth. Like, even if I speak the language reasonably well, there are some differences. So yes, if you're very short on survey time, you can cut it, but I think it's, even in a population that speaks a language very well, it's still interesting to ask these questions.
Thanks, Niklas and Maureen. We also got a series of questions that get to the question about comparability or applying it across different populations and what to consider. And David, in your conclusion, you wrapped up by talking about how the tool is really built to try to be flexible and something could be applied across a diverse range of immigrant groups. A couple of questions that we got that maybe, David, if you want to speak to, or Niklas, are there anything that needs to be considered when you're looking at using this measure with people with families, with children versus, maybe single individuals? Is the index appropriate to be used with children or youth under the age of 18 and or people with low literacy rates? And then we also had a question about anything that would need to be considered with looking at, say, second-generation immigrants versus first-generation immigrants and thinking about the time that maybe people have been in the country. Is there any responses or guidance that you have to those questions?
I think that the tool is something like 2 minutes of survey time. And one of the things we want to encourage is for this to be part of a wider survey dealing with many other things besides successful integration into the host society. And then we would be able to say things like, we see the larger the size of the family, the greater the social integration. I'm just making this up. But we would be able to test a variety of hypotheses about the conditions for successful integration. But we want to keep separate the measure of successful integration from the conditions which might lead to it. So most of these issues are ones to say, under what conditions will you get success? That's exactly what we want to learn for purposes of public policy. And by putting all the good things into the index, we wouldn't be able to make any statements about the conditions which lead to successful integration. We would just have a richer and richer measure of the description of integration. So I think of these questions as crucial for understanding the questions of the sources of successful integration rather than the definition of it.
Maybe I can directly add one more point to that and then address some of the questions. So I think there was also the question, what kind of questions we cut. So actually, a large chunk that we cut were questions regarding discrimination and racism. We had that in for a long time, and then we realized, okay, this isn't really something an individual immigrant can change, or a policy or some program can change, right? This like discrimination will affect your integration level, but this is something people do that are not. So this is basically out of the scope of the integration success. It's a third factor that can explain why integration is better or worse in different groups. we don't want to include this in the index for the reasons David outlined. And regarding the other questions, I think you can use it for second generation. As I said, all questions are phrased in a way that you can ask them to native population, which I think the second generation is. You might want to ask some more specific questions regarding the experience as a second generation immigrant. But if you want to compare levels of integration between first and second generation, and I don't know, third, fourth, or so forth, yes, you can definitely use the same set of questions, because they are phrased in a way that they can be answered by anyone regardless of their migration experience. Regarding youth, I mean, I think if you go too young, the questions are no longer appropriate. I think with like 16-year-olds, I think most questions would still work. If you go much younger, you might have an age effect, that they answer some questions differently than others just because of their age. And there is actually, I was in contact with a researcher, I think from France, who wanted to adapt the questions to survey children. And basically what I advised was to go and look at the literature we use to come up with our questions. So for example, for psychological integration, we took questions from psychologists, well-established questions from psychologists, and basically look into this literature if there are similar questions that are made for younger people. But yeah, if you go, I think I wouldn't survey people younger than 16 with our questions. There's also the question if you should wait a certain time to administer the question. So if you should only survey immigrants that have been in the country for a year or two, or I would say this really depends on the context. Like, just looking at the question, you can use these questions and survey someone who just crossed the border. Some of the responses will be, I mean, the integration will be very low probably for many questions, but I mean, this is what we would expect. And then you can ask the same person after a year or two. In our paper, we look at how the score develops over the length of residency in a country. And what we see is a steep incline in the first 5 to 10 years, and then it sort of like levels off. And I think this is the most interesting time to use this tool, because there's a lot of movement there. But just talking from a measurement perspective, I don't think you would need to wait. Also, there was the question if we should think about this as a survey tool for immigrants as opposed to, or regular immigrants as opposed to refugees. And I think the legal status and the circumstances of the migration are another interesting covariate of the index. But you can use the index to survey labor immigrants or refugees. In fact, we just used it to survey refugees in Germany and had very interesting results. So I think you can definitely use it on every immigrant or even non-immigrant, but be sure to also measure things like legal status if you think that this is important, because the legal status might impact things like your ability to work, and you would want to know the legal status. But these are, as David said, these like interesting other variables.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Niklas. And I do, just because we've been getting a lot of questions, want to underscore David's first point about it's important to differentiate between what constitutes integration and what may drive or facilitate it. And so that's why our measure doesn't include things like housing, the policy context, access to social welfare services, because we think those are things that could be very important for driving or facilitating integration, but do not necessarily measure integration within themselves. And we hope that the tool could be useful in really understanding the role that some of these different services or policies play in helping people from different groups achieve successful integration. The next question I wanted to turn to has to do with surveying the same population over time. So we have a question from Kim about, are there any instances of the IPL-12 or the IPL-24 being implemented with the same group at different points in time? And then a related question from Justin is, for contexts where there might be a lot of surveying of different populations about integration, especially over time, are we confident, or are there any concerns about being able to measure or compare integration scores over time if there's a lot of runs of surveys that are measuring these integration questions? David, Niklas, do you want to start by addressing this?
I think that as the question revealed, almost all our construct validity questions were cross-sectional, and they were not panel studies. That is the same population over time. And this is something that we've done once in the Middle East, but we are working very hard now with a group called Global Detroit to work with refugees in southeastern Michigan to basically give the IPL-12 index at time 1, introduce a treatment for housing, and then give it to the IPL-12 to the same group a year later to see whether, in fact, a randomized set of folk who got this treatment had higher integration scores. And we still are not sure how well the panel approach would work, because the subjects will, of course, remember the questions from the last time and maybe try to be consistent with the last time rather than update. So we don't know how it will work as a panel, but this is a crucial future test of our tool.
I think one of the projects Marine worked with in, I think, Peru had a pre-intervention, post-intervention setup. Is that correct?
Yeah, so but the time period was very short. It's just like a few months between the 2 rounds of data collection. But we do use the index in another project where we look at the integration trajectories of refugees who are resettled mainly from Lebanon, Turkey, and Egypt to Switzerland. And we interview them like every 6 months for 2 years, from like almost the first 2 weeks after they arrived in Switzerland. But the panel is still ongoing, so I don't have like clear data on this, but we are using it and asking these questions every 6 months.
I think one point I would add is that if you use the questions repeatedly, I would again advise to use only the IPL-12 questions, because, I mean, for one, you don't want to annoy your respondents, and the IPL-24 has 2 sets of quiz questions. There's a short quiz on political integration and a short quiz on navigational integration. And of course, here you might think that if in the first wave you asked a respondent, how would you write an address on a letter in the United States, and they didn't feel like they knew the correct answer, they might go home and look it up, and then they know it in the next iteration of the panel, just because you asked this question in the first wave. And this would be an effect we would want to avoid. So for repeated measurement for different reasons, I would advise to use the IPL-12. But other than that, I don't see why repeated measurement, if it isn't like measured every day, but in reasonable intervals, I think this should work.
The next question that I'd be curious to get the panel's thoughts on is from Fethi. And they asked if there's an effort to look at how the different dimensions of integrations interact with or relate to each other. So you talked a little bit about this, Niklas, with some of the validation exercises, but what about looking into, how and whether language proficiency impacts labor market integration or economic integration, and vice versa? Any thoughts on that, Niklas, David, Marine?
I'm not aware of systematic research on that, and I think once we have something like the data from the panel Marine described, this would be great research. I think so. Talking from a recent project I was involved in, I think it's very interesting to look at the different dimensions separately. So, for example, we did a survey on Ukrainian refugees in Germany, some of them who were assigned to public housing for refugees, and some of them who were assigned to private housing, so basically live-in housing where they lived with families or something similar. And we checked if a year later the integration scores differed. And we found a small positive effect of staying your first 6 weeks in the country with a family and not in public accommodation on the overall integration. But if we looked at it on the individual dimensions, we saw that this effect was mainly focused in the areas of, I think, psychological integration, navigational integration, and social integration. Not so much in terms of economic integration, for example, or linguistic integration. And I think this is very interesting because it shows how hard integration is. And it shows that, I don't know, for example, learning German is a tough thing. And although you might have the support of a family, it's still not that easy. And after a year, you don't see much of a difference in terms of how well someone speaks German who's staying with a family or with in a public accommodation. And the same is true, for example, in Germany, at least, because we have a very restricted labor market, that getting a job is not that easy. And just staying with a family doesn't help you a ton with getting a job there, which might be different in the United States. But I think looking at these different, like how programs work on the different dimensions is very interesting and shows how this index can be used. But I think I'm not aware of any research that does that systematically. And I think it would be great to do that once we have a bit more data.
So we're coming up close to the end of our time, and this might be one of the last questions, but if people have other questions they want to ask again, please add them to the chat or raise your hand, and you will have, by virtue of the invitation, our contact information if you'd like to follow up with any additional questions or have a conversation, because as you can see, there's a lot of interest on our side as well, with both learning about how you may be utilizing a tool like this and getting your feedback on it, but also thinking about whether there might be opportunities to work with you to, say, collect more panel data. Both Humatal and Venu had questions about kind of policy impact and the way this can be used by policymakers. Have we seen policymakers actually using this measure to inform policy or practice changes? Maybe, Maureen, this is something you can speak to based on your experience with the multiple applications that you discussed. And similarly, Venu asked, can the topics on the survey serve as a guide to policymakers on what to achieve or strive for with new arrivals? So one of the goals of policymakers would be to help immigrants identify resources in their host community or country. So how can a tool like this be used to actually inform, what policymakers should be doing from a policy standpoint to try to help with integration? Maureen, do you want to take a first stab at this?
Sure, thanks, Adam. So on the policymakers taking up the index, I think it's a bit early. I mean, I haven't seen like a lot of examples, but I think a good case is like the collaboration we had with IOM. So we adapted the integration index to 3 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. But I know, and people in the audience from IOM should react to this if they can, that IOM also is interested in using it in many other contexts where they work. So I don't know exactly in which countries they want to use it, but I know there was a lot of interest within IOM and to IOM's partners when they presented the index. So I'm sure it's going to be used in other places as well.
David, Niklas, any examples that you know of or thoughts on how policymakers could best use a tool like this or use the results from it to inform the work that they're doing on the ground with different immigrant populations?
Sometimes it's not just policymakers. We did the IPL index with ESL, English as second language students in Silicon Valley. And as Adam mentioned earlier, many of the respondents were doing very well economically, but had never actually chatted or met someone they would consider a Native American. And the program then, recognizing this was a difficulty, started organizing home visits for their ESL students to try to get them to meet people outside their own relatively closed network. So here's an example where an organization sees where it's been successful and where it can do better, and making some changes in the way it offers its services to the constituent population.
Yes, I think so. I worked with a handful of smaller NGOs that wanted to learn about the impact of the program, and they used basically a very simple pre and post design using this index, and they try to improve the program based on the index. So that was definitely some impact. I think if you look at where our paper is cited, sometimes you see policy reports where the paper is cited in a way that it says, well, there are different aspects to integration. Like, it's not enough to just look at income and employment. There are actually other dimensions. Keep that in mind. So that is definitely also some impact. And then I say it's not only about the index in itself that has an impact, but how you apply it. So for example, the study we ran in Germany on the effect of privately hosting refugees, there was quite a bit of interest by policymakers, because when this became a large phenomenon in Germany and also in the UK, after many Ukrainians came to Western Europe, a lot of people feared that there could be a net negative effect, that there would be exploitation going on and so forth. And I think we were the first research to show that this wasn't a big concern, and that the effect, if there is a systematic effect, is rather positive. So here I think there was definitely some interest, but this is not only the index, this is how you apply it. And then if policymakers should basically learn from the index, I think this is not what it was made for, right? We basically, I mean, policymakers could introduce some program and then use the index to see if the program works, definitely. But for policymaker to look at the question and be like, okay, we should definitely improve or change our program depending on this question. I wouldn't say that this is wrong, because we took our questions from a large literature of integration that claims that this is an important part of integration. So we took this from all the literature that says like having an income, having employment is important, feeling at home is important, having social contact is important. So we didn't pick these dimensions at random, but I don't think that we wrote the questions as policy advice.
So we are at time. I still see that there's some questions in the chat that have to relate to what we went over earlier on the webinar. So I would encourage you still have questions about the navigational dimensions or what we measure on different reports. Savannah, our communications manager, dropped some links into the chat that you should definitely follow up. You can also follow up on the email that was put in the chat if you have specific questions that were not addressed or that came up after you think about everything that we've talked about today. I'd like to thank, before we conclude, both Savannah, our communications manager, and Samantha, our operations associate, for helping us put this webinar together and helping gather all of your questions and get all of you here to be able to discuss this. I think we've had a very fruitful conversation. And again, this will be recorded. So if you missed anything during our conversations, you'll be able to go back and either watch it or, as I said, reference the different tools on the website. Thank you also to Maureen, Niklas, and David for taking the time to talk about the IPL-12 and to answer these questions. And we look forward to getting more feedback. We're always looking to both improve the tool and to learn about how it's used, and to think about ways that we can work with those of you who are trying to help different immigrant groups integrate. We are always interested in working with you to kind of generate evidence and knowledge that'll help you do that better. So do not hesitate to reach out to us. So with that, I will leave it there, and I hope that you all have a good day and the rest of your week, and appreciate you attending this webinar with us. Thank you.